I'm Parker Yanni, and today I'll be talking about the oral history project I did for my History 204 class at Pepperdine with Professor Beeman. When seeing an oral history project was an option for one of my portfolio projects, I was skeptical about what I would learn from it, but I decided to give it a go because I love talking to people and hearing about their lives. I did not think that learning history through the memory of another person was super reliable because memories change over time, or that it could encompass nearly as much as a textbook could. I really, in all honesty, chose it because I thought it would be really fun and super easy. I'm happy to say, though, that I was proven very wrong. I chose to do my interview with a very close family friend, Gary Wagoneer, who served in the Vietnam War and has had lots of lived life experience in many different walks of life. Through my interview with Gary, I've learned that oral history encompasses so much more than a textbook ever could offer. One of the biggest things that comes with oral history is the detail and inclusion of smaller events and stories that the history books just don't have. When reading a history book or when you're learning in a class, you learn a generalized lesson. By that I mean that you learn about the big events and how they connected to each other on a timeline. What you do not get, though, is the incredible personal details only individuals who have been there and lived it can share. Going into the interview, I had conducted some preliminary research through articles, YouTube videos, and movies that I watched for my other portfolio project on the Vietnam War, so that I had a general understanding of the big events and things that happened there. However, Gary was able to inform me and teach me about many things that went on that could not be found in the research I had done. One such example of this was a story that he told me about how Vietnam rebels would get in boats and drive up to the American bases and would shoot at the bases to scare the troops, something that didn't cause retaliation from the troops, but was still extremely unnerving to them. Things like this give such a broader picture to what really happened in Vietnam and really make you understand it on a deeper level. We can know the big events, but we will not always know what it was really like to be there. To begin our conversation, I asked Gary about his childhood and what it was like for him growing up, just to build some rapport. Born in 1947, Gary grew up in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, constantly hunting, fishing, and biking. He's a man of the woods and even said in our interview, "If you put me in a city, I would be eaten alive within a week, but in the woods, I would thrive." By the time the Vietnam War came around, Gary knew his number was going to be called in the draft, and to try and avoid boots on the ground combat and avoid going to Vietnam altogether, he decided to voluntarily enroll himself in the Navy. From there, he was sent to a San Diego base in which he worked on the Fleet Air Control Team, which he described as playing war games and being a part of the unit that would be given orders and control over the southern section of the naval fleet. After Lyndon Johnson died, though, they began upscaling the war, and Gary was sent to Vietnam, where he served for about a year. I asked Gary several questions about his time in Vietnam. The first being what his base was like in Vietnam and how his relationship with the local Vietnamese was. Gary was stationed at a base several miles outside of the city of Da Nang. The base itself was a repurposed Vietnam base from when just a few years earlier they were at odds with and fighting the French. As per what the relationship was the Vietnamese, he was not supposed to fraternize with the locals, something that was a lot different from what was depicted in the movies I had watched. While it doesn't entirely contradict what was shown in the films, Gary explains that each base was slightly different and implemented different rules. The base had a chow hall and a beer hall where the men could go instead of having to go out locally for food or fun. Furthermore, because Da Nang and his base was so close to the DMZ in northern Vietnam, they adopted a policy not to fraternize with locals out of fear because they didn't know who they might run into. While Gary said he never saw combat, the base being so close to enemy lines would be under constant torment from the northern soldiers. The base would come under fire frequently from rocket and mortar fire, although there were never any major assaults. Gary described how on the very first night he was there, they started receiving incoming fire and he looked outside and it looked like the daytime because of all the flares and tracer bullets flying through the air. After that night, he said he always was on his toes and slept with one eye open. I then asked Gary about what the war was about. and he explained the domino theory to me. He explained that China and Russia were communist powers that were supporting northern Vietnam to become a communist power, and like a domino, it would lead to other countries following suit. The US, in fear of this plot, though, tried to prevent the spread of communism, and that's why they got involved in the war. I then asked how his time in Vietnam in the service shaped his life, and his response was fascinating. Gary detailed how his military experience exposed the truth behind the human nature to him. Growing up in such a small town, Gary explained how he was very naive when he went off to serve, and that his expectations of people weren't what the reality was. He pointed to honesty and how people often tell the truth as a prime example. In his town and growing up, everything was built off of trust in your word. He even said, "I grew up in an era where your word was good. If I said, 'Hey, I'm going to be at your house tomorrow at 5 in the morning, we're going fishing,' I was at your house tomorrow morning at 5 and we went fishing. That is not the way the world works. That is not the way the world works." That was one of the things that was really eye-opening to me, was human nature and how I thought everyone thought like me in my little town, because in my little town, everyone did. The things Gary witnessed and saw drastically changed his understanding of how the world works. He also detailed how when he was in Vietnam, he also saw many awful things and horrors, such as fellow soldiers committing suicide, and that changed his perspective on things as well. My final question to Gary was asking if he believed that we should have been involved in the Vietnam War at all, because it is a very controversial topic, and as the war continued to go on, it became increasingly unpopular amongst the people of America. His answer was two-sided, though, as he was pretty much torn about it. While he supported the U.S. cause to stop the expansion of communism, he believes that it was executed poorly. He explained that the U.S. didn't have a solid plan to defeat northern Vietnam, and as a result, the war dragged on and became pointless. He also talked about how the states became more and more anti-war, and specifically mentioning John Kerry and his involvement in that through different public stunts like throwing his war medals over the White House fences and ridiculing American soldiers by calling them baby killers, amongst other things. Gary explained that he had ridiculed American military people over an incident in which there were many civilians killed, and Gary said that for that he hated him and could not forgive him. We then drifted off into a larger conversation about life and different lessons he had learned and wanted to pass on to me. I learned most important part about oral history is the wisdom that is passed on through it. While a history book can tell you about events so you can learn about history, as in not repeat the mistakes in it, through oral history a person can tell you what they learned from the different events that they lived through and the wisdom they have acquired from them. One of the wisest things that I believe I have ever heard in my life came from this oral history interview. Gary told me that what he believed to be true diversity after knowing all that he knew and experiencing what he did in his life. Gary told me that the only diversity between me and him, and, me and anybody else, is what's in our hearts, what's in our minds, and what we do with the 24 hours in our day. A textbook cannot pass down this wisdom, and that is why it is so important to have oral history, because we learn so much from it and how it affects people. In the end, I have realized oral history is very important and that there is much to be learned from it. Even though Gary never saw combat during the Vietnam War, talking to him and hearing about the stories and his time in the service provided me with a much more nuanced and sympathetic view of the Vietnam War and really humanized these events for me. I believe after doing this that everyone should be encouraged to learn from oral history and to remember that there is more to history than just names and dates of events. When you put a face to the people affected by such events, you can understand them in a whole new light. Thank you very much.